The story of a young tech entrepreneur facing criminal charges now.
This morning, Charlie Javice, founder of the financial and nonprofit Frank, could be facing up to 100 years in prison.
Former Forbes 30 Under 30 Frank founder
accused of, quote, falsely and dramatically inflating the number of customers that the company had
to fraudulently induce JPMorgan Chase to acquire Frank for $175 million.
She netted $45 million from the sale.
How in the world does this happen?
How the hell could Chase be so stupid?
There's a lot of people around a transaction of this size.
You tell me that no one decided to do due diligence and actually see if the users were real?
This would have been so easy to audit.
I wonder who was on the board here. Who was watching the shop? Who was advising this founder?
How do they think she did this? Was the whole company corrupt?
Nobody looks good in this thing, and frankly, this whole thing's a show.
Obviously, what she did was very, very wrong and very, very illegal, but I am so fascinated by a good scam.
And this grift is just,
This is like if the feds came up and they're like, hey, Charlie, we caught you on camera.
And again, innocent until proven guilty, but it's not looking good.
Welcome back to this series on Charlie Javice, the Elizabeth Holmes of FinTech. We've been digging into all the details of this crazy con for a minute now, and so if you have not watched the past videos, then let me catch you up. In episode 1, we learned about Charlie's first shady startup that was supposed to rid the world of poverty, but spoiler alert, that didn't happen. And I told you how she lost $500,000 in investor funds and got sued by her co-founder. Then in episode 2, we untangled the web of deception that Charlie spun around her next company, Frank, that claimed to help students pay for college, but actually pushed slimy loans on them through predatory false advertising. Next up in episode 3, I showed you the utterly lazy ways that Charlie faked her company's data and invented millions of phony users, and we read these salty internal Slack messages written by her employees that showed them freaking out behind the scenes about their boss's new magic numbers. But all of these sneaky maneuvers by Charlie apparently went undetected by JPMorgan because the bank ended up shelling out $175 million to buy her company Frank. That brings us to the last episode where we saw hit the fan after JPMorgan found out they'd been tricked. Then they fired Charlie for fraud and they sued her for ripping them off. Now, of course, Charlie didn't take that lying down because she hired Elon Musk's old attorney to sue JPMorgan back, and this dude served up a sensational story claiming that JPMorgan was the one to blame and Charlie was the innocent victim. And that's where we pick up with this episode, because not only are lawsuits flying between these two sides in civil court, but the federal government has also entered the ring and filed a bunch of criminal charges against Charlie that could send her to prison for the rest of her life. So, now that everybody is coming at Charlie for blood, in this video I'm going to show you how she's been busy building up her defenses, including the curious ways she's been moving her assets around and the savage victory that her attorney scored against JPMorgan in court. Plus, you'll meet the boyfriend she's been shacking up with in Florida who has his own interesting career history, and I'll tell you why federal prosecutors just might have the last laugh on all of this because they just secured an order from a judge that could make Charlie's legal battles so much harder to survive. Welcome to Miami, Florida, a land of softly swaying palms, powdery white sand beaches, and warm winter days reaching the mid-70s. It's a far cry from the chilly concrete of New York City where Charlie used to live, but maybe she was ready for a change of scenery because a couple of years ago, shortly before she sold her company Frank to JPMorgan, Charlie purchased a swanky seaside condominium in Miami for $1.4 million. So, why would Charlie make a cross-country move from the financial capital of the world less than 2 months before she started negotiating a deal to sell her fintech company to a bank on Wall Street? Could she have been anticipating that JPMorgan might sue her for fraud and ask a court to make her pay them their money back? Did she want to move to a state that could help her protect her assets if that happened? Well, it's worth mentioning that if you get sued in Florida and you lose and a judge orders you to pay the other party a bunch of money, then your opponent can't force you to sell your home so that you can pay them what they're owed. In Florida, your home is exempt from creditors who are trying to collect debts from you. And look, many states besides Florida have laws like this on the books that protect people's homes, but Florida's rules are known to be the most generous to sleazebags who owe people money because there's no limit to how ridiculously expensive your home can be. So that might explain why Charlie is suddenly a fan of warmer weather, which for the time being she can enjoy because she's been released on a $2 million bond. Now, while we're speaking about Charlie's new condo in Florida, it looks like she ain't the only one living there because it seems she has a boyfriend who's shacking up there too, according to voting records, which list a man named Elliot Bertram as living at Charlie's place too, according to Fortune.com. Now, Charlie and Elliot share more than an address though, because Elliot has also worked in the financial services industry. He used to be employed at a hedge fund named Platinum Partners, which is just the name you'd expect for a company charged by federal regulators as running a $1 billion investment fraud. Now, Elliot was never charged in that fraud, and there's no evidence he was involved in it, but he did apparently meet extensively with attorneys who were handling legal claims that resulted from this investment scheme, so maybe he can give Charlie some tips to help her in the many court battles she is facing. Or maybe she and Elliot are not discussing strategy, maybe they're just partying it up, because Charlie was supposed to have a 9 p.m. curfew after she was charged, but Yahoo reported in April that she was trying to extend that curfew to 11 p.m., according to court records, which makes me think, girl, just tuck in early and don't push your luck at this point, but we know that's not how Charlie rolls. See, Charlie's move to Florida to purchase her pricey coastal condo might not be the only way she could be trying to protect her assets, because JPMorgan has also accused her of creating shell companies to try to funnel money out of her name and to try to hide her cash. Charlie had received millions of dollars from JPMorgan after it bought her company Frank, but after the bank learned that she had faked Frank's users to score the deal from them, of course JPMorgan felt like she ripped them off and swindled them out of those millions. And so they said that when they fired Charlie from her job for misconduct, they specifically told her not to spend any of that money that they paid her from the Frank merger. Despite these instructions that JPMorgan says that it gave Charlie, 8 days later, Charlie created 3 companies in Nevada: Chariot Holdings X, 1, and 2. JPMorgan calls these Chariot entities shell companies because they say that they don't appear to have any legit business operations. They're just empty shells with no purpose other than to help Charlie move her money out of Chase's view. The bank says Charlie is the manager and the only officer for these companies, and she didn't register these companies in New York or Florida, where she's lived. She created these entities in Nevada, a state that's known to be a popular place for shell companies because it doesn't make businesses disclose who owns them. It doesn't make businesses file annual financial reports or pay income taxes, and it's hard for creditors to seize your assets if you owe them money. And so Nevada is the perfect place to set up a fake business, something that Charlie is obviously familiar with, so that you can funnel ill-gotten gains away from the people you swindled, which is exactly what JPMorgan says Charlie did here. They say that 2 days after she created those companies named Chariot Holdings, she transferred millions of dollars that Chase had paid her for Frank out of her personal bank accounts at Chase and into an account held by one of her new Chariot companies at a different bank. Because of that, JPMorgan wrote to the court and basically said, look, we're worried about where Charlie's going to move this money next and whether we're going to be able to track it down even if we do win this lawsuit. Because if we can convince the court to order Charlie to pay us damages, but she's made all that money disappear, then we're still going to be left holding the bag. After JPMorgan raises these concerns to the court, though, Charlie's attorney, Alex Spiro, had plenty to say in response. He said, first of all, JPMorgan can worry all they want about this money, but it ain't theirs. It's Charlie's, and she can do what she wants with it. He said the bank had no right to trace Charlie's transactions or to interrogate her about what she did with her own assets. And he said that considering that JPMorgan Chase was suing his client, of course Charlie didn't want to leave her money held in accounts at their bank because that's awkward. That's the last place she wanted to leave her millions of dollars. And he said the fact that JPMorgan has been abusing its power to spy on her bank accounts just shows that Charlie had every right to be worried about keeping her money at their institution. Plus, Charlie's lawyer argues that JPMorgan has nothing to worry about anyway because he says that Charlie's accounts have been frozen by prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office, so she can't access those funds anyway, and so JPMorgan should relax knowing that that money's not going anywhere. Now, if it's true that Charlie's assets have been seized by the feds, then that would create some major cash flow issues for her because, remember, she's fighting multiple lawsuits right now, and she's hired that hotshot attorney Alex Spiro, who has a roster of rich celebrity clients who are flush with cash to pay him, so I am sure that his services ain't cheap. And so how is Charlie footing his attorney bills if she can't touch her assets? Well, this is nuts, but her lawyers managed to secure his bag in the most savage way possible. I know this sounds crazy, but y'all, this is real. Charlie's attorney has successfully convinced the court to force JPMorgan to pay her attorney bills while they sue her. So, how is this reality? Well, in the merger contracts between JPMorgan and Frank, there were actually a few sections where JPMorgan promised to cover Charlie's legal bills if she ever got in trouble doing her job. Now, you might be asking, why would JPMorgan ever agree to that? Well, it's actually very common that companies promise to pay their employees' legal bills in case they get sued while they're on the job for something that wasn't their fault. So imagine you work at a car dealership and you're selling cars to customers and telling them that these are really well-made vehicles, but it turns out that somebody back at the factory was screwing up on the assembly line and you had no idea this was happening. And now that all your customers' cars have fallen apart, they're suing you left and right. It would seem pretty unfair that you should have to pay for a bunch of legal bills when this whole thing wasn't your fault. And that's why a lot of employment contracts require the company to pay attorney fees if the employee gets sued doing their job in good faith. And so because Charlie's contracts with JPMorgan included these terms, of course her attorneys were quick to point that out to the bank and say, hey, you promised to pay her legal costs, and look, we have a very expensive hourly fee and we sent you a bill for our services, so where is our money? Now JPMorgan was like, we ain't paying that, and so it went to a judge who, believe it or not, has now ruled that JPMorgan must in fact pay Charlie's attorney fees while they sue her, which is nuts. And the New York Post reported that they'll probably have to cover her legal bills for her criminal case too. Now, if Charlie ends up losing her case to JPMorgan or the federal government, then JPMorgan could go after her and try to make her repay all the bills that they covered. But before we jump to that conclusion, I want to bring up another trick that Charlie has up her sleeve. There was another standard clause in the contracts between JPMorgan and Frank that said the only terms that the two sides were agreeing to in this deal were the ones that were written in the official contracts. It basically said, look, we know we said a lot of stuff back there in negotiations. We made this promise, you made this promise, and then things changed and things were taken off the table. A lot of things were said. But now that we've struck a deal, we both agree to forget everything we said up to this point and just stick to what's written in these agreements. And so we all agree not to sue over anything that was said back in negotiations. Because of that, Charlie's attorney argues that even if she told JPMorgan that Frank had 4.25 million users before this deal, that doesn't matter because JPMorgan agreed not to hold her liable for that and to only use what was written in the contract. And Charlie's attorneys say that nowhere in this contract does it say that Frank is promising JPMorgan that it has 4.25 million users, and so JPMorgan can't now be suing Frank and Charlie because of that. But JPMorgan's attorneys say, oh yes, we can. They say there are several promises in the merger agreement that Frank ended up breaking, like the one where Frank swore that there had been no fraud involving the managers at the company, or that there had been no fraud related to the claims that Frank made during the merger. or like the promise where Frank agreed to disclose any important contracts worth more than $50,000, which JPMorgan says definitely should have included those last-minute sketchy contracts that Frank made with all those data marketing companies to buy those student email addresses so that Charlie and her co-founder Olivier could fake their user data. JPMorgan says those were clearly over $50,000, but somehow Frank conveniently forgot to mention those to us during the acquisition. And speaking of that, JPMorgan says that Charlie's attorney has yet to explain why those emails were ever bought in the first place. They say Charlie's lawyer has filed pages and pages of claims with the court, but nowhere does he give any reason why Frank would purchase the data of students who had no relationship with Frank and then hand it over to JPMorgan and say, here are our users. And why hasn't he done that? Well, JPMorgan says because he can't explain this. How could Charlie's attorney explain the WhatsApp message that she got from her co-founder Olivier right after Olivier sealed the deal to buy a big batch of those email addresses where he told Charlie, you'll have your 4.5 million users today? To which Charlie replied, perfect. Y'all, I don't know how Charlie's attorney is going to justify that, but he better think of something, not only for the civil lawsuit brought by JPMorgan where they're seeking money from Charlie, but also for the 2 criminal cases brought by the federal government against Charlie where prosecutors could put her behind bars for the rest of her life.
Now to a high-profile fraud case.
She was a hotshot in the startup world.
But this looks really bad. The founder's name is Charlie Javice.
She founded a company called Frank.
She sold the company to Chase Bank for millions of dollars, and it turns out that it was literally all fraud.
Javice faces several counts of bank and wire fraud and securities fraud.
If you read the government statement, they basically say she's a con artist.
We have more demand than we're able to handle, and so we're staffing up, and it's wonderful to see a company grow from a strong foundation. And I think when you do something that has, is mission positive, you do end up making a business out of it.
2 separate federal agencies, the U.S. Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission, have filed criminal lawsuits against Charlie that wage serious fraud charges, including charges that each carry a maximum jail sentence lasting decades. So Charlie could be looking at getting locked up for good thanks to all this Frank fakery. Now, given the overwhelming amount of evidence against her, you might think she would consider cutting a deal with prosecutors where she'd fess up to her crimes and, in exchange, the feds might agree to give her a lighter sentence. But that might force Charlie to compromise in ways that she's not willing to do. For example, if she struck a plea deal with the DOJ or the SEC, they would likely make her sign a settlement agreement that would ban her from the securities industry for life. And that would mean she could never be in control of another startup that asked investors for funding. And that could be hell for Charlie because we know there's nothing she loves more than asking people for money. Another reason why Charlie might not want to strike a plea deal with prosecutors is because it would inevitably hurt her civil case. If she were to plead guilty to fraud against JPMorgan in criminal court, then how could she hop on over to civil court and claim she was totally innocent for the same offenses? A plea deal would blow up her entire civil case because her admission of guilt in criminal court would be admissible as direct evidence of her wrongdoing in the civil case, according to an attorney who spoke with Fortune.com. So, with that in mind, Charlie better hope that her civil case comes before her criminal case so that she can claim she's innocent over in civil court and try to avoid paying JPMorgan, and then she can run on over to criminal court and plead guilty in exchange for less jail time once her civil case is done. The problem is that the federal government has made sure Charlie doesn't have that option, though. The Department of Justice filed a motion in Charlie's civil case that JPMorgan brought where they asked the judge to pause that civil case until their criminal case is finished. The federal government argued that if the civil case went first, it would cause all sorts of evidence to come out at different times, and that would interfere with their criminal case against Charlie. And ultimately, the judge agreed to grant the federal government's motion to put Charlie's civil case on hold until her criminal one is resolved. So that makes it much trickier for Charlie to cut a plea deal with prosecutors now, because it would all but ensure she lost her civil case with JPMorgan. But y'all, regardless of which case Charlie is fighting first, do we really think that she would ever admit to doing anything wrong after everything we've seen from her? Would she really confess to committing a fraud after she presented that soap opera defense in the last episode claiming she was the victim of JPMorgan's scapegoating? Can you really see her coming clean and admitting she's a liar? Well, I, for one, cannot. And predictably, Charlie has pled not guilty in her criminal case with the DOJ, which is impressive considering the sheer amount of evidence against her, but again, not surprising considering this is Charlie. In fact, Charlie allegedly shook her head repeatedly at the federal prosecutor in court as he accused her of lying about Frank's user base. So clearly, she is firmly standing her ground when it comes to her innocence, so it'll be interesting to see whether her conviction ends up landing her behind bars.
Sam Bankman-Fried, Elizabeth Holmes, now this woman. Sometimes when things seem to be too good to be true, they are too good to be true.
When you get to a position where you are so early on in your career, it actually makes you kind of earn trust and earn respect a lot earlier on because of all the roadblocks you may have faced.
When I was younger, I'd often go to Barnes & Noble and I'd pick up all the business magazines off the shelf, Fast Company, Entrepreneur, Forbes, Inc., and I would read in these magazines these profiles of CEOs who were my age, and they were running companies worth millions of dollars, and they were pioneering solutions that would transform society. And I remember thinking, wow, I am a mere mortal compared to these superhumans. They're like a different species. I'm over here still trying to figure out how to do my taxes right, and so they must be geniuses on a level I can't even understand. But after growing up, moving to San Francisco, and seeing just how many frauds excel there, I realized something. The people who end up in these publications are often not the ones who really deserve recognition. They're just the ones who know how to market themselves the best. The truth is that these magazines would not exist if businesses didn't need to promote their products, if gurus didn't need to sell their books. And even though I used to be one of those readers who assumed that these magazines had teams of journalists who were fact-checking every article, the truth is that they don't. The businesses they feature are not turning over their bank passwords so that Fast Company can verify their income claims. If a CEO says she's a proud parent of 3 kids, Forbes is not going to DNA swab each of her children to confirm that she's telling the truth. But even though the news can't realistically verify every quote they print, they should at least have a shred of skepticism before they exalt a 26-year-old as a top business leader without asking any questions. And I will be the first to admit that as a journalist, I have been guilty of doing this. When I first moved to Silicon Valley, I was blown away by everybody's impressive LinkedIn profiles. And I felt like the small-town girl from South Carolina who was taking photos in front of the Twitter building. I ended up doing this video series where I interviewed a bunch of inspirational entrepreneurs, and one of them, who went on to make a huge name for herself, ended up being a little snaky, to me at least, and I helped push her motivational story, and that is a problem. When the media just blindly gives a megaphone to anybody who's willing to play the hero, the frauds are going to come running in full force so that they can spew out sappy lines to draw in new victims.
When we think about profits and purpose, most people today don't think about it together. And that's something that we really pride ourselves on.
In reality, though, someone who knew Charlie back when she was first pitching Frank said that she would tell investors that Frank had thousands of users before it even had a product built. Another insider who knew Charlie told Forbes, "We'd all start looking at each other like, this is insanity. You can't be saying these things. We all understand the art of the sale, but some of the things that were being said were just inexcusably inaccurate." This person also told Forbes that when Charlie's staff confronted her about her exaggerations, her response was always, "Listen, these old people don't understand. This is how it works. You fake it till you make it." Until you make it and you can't fake it anymore, but Charlie didn't think about that. What is a risk not worth taking?
I would say, what risk isn't worth taking? Might as well try. If you fail, the lowest you can fall is on your butt.
This was the big miscalculation that Charlie made. She underestimated the risks. She underestimated everybody. She always thought she was the smartest person in the room.
You meet smart people, you meet not smart people, or a lot of not smart people.
This was a repeating theme in her interviews where she'd diss everybody around her. She said her high school principal was small-minded.
He just didn't think about it in a creative way to actually solve for a problem.
She said her guidance counselor there sucked at his job.
His theory was, as long as you're happy, you'll enjoy going to college.
She said she couldn't find a college that had professors qualified enough for her education.
There was a lack of talent and a lack of management and leadership.
She said her investors just didn't understand Frank's business.
Investors who are usually wealthy, have inherited it, or made their money, have zero exposure to FAFSA or the financial aid process.
She blamed the federal government for not having students' backs.
They look at us and they go, wow, these are our competitors. Let's not help them scale.
And she said her bosses at JPMorgan were unethical idiots. It was always everybody else's fault but Charlie's. And it was this degree of delusion, this disconnection from reality, that not only allowed Charlie to BS her way to the top, but it was also what took her down. Because when you're used to getting rewarded for achievements that you didn't actually reach, you get lazy. You don't do your research. You don't do the work needed because you think you'll never get caught. I mean, Charlie, you didn't ever once look at how many years in prison you could get for defrauding a bank out of millions of dollars. You've never watched a 48 Hours and seen you can't leave a digital paper trail when you're committing crimes. Girl, come on. But maybe the most ironic part of this whole story is that the slogan for Frank was dream smart.
Dream smart is what we like to say. Dream big, but dream smart.
And even though Charlie clearly did not follow her own advice, you should. You should dream big, but dream smart. Don't compare yourself to these phony gurus who have weaseled their way into a magazine. Don't fall for this nonsense of fake it till you make it. Don't chase clout and recognition for your accomplishments, but focus on the actual impact of your actions and how you are truly affecting people's lives. And I promise you that will be so much more rewarding in the long run. All right, y'all, we have reached the end of this deep dive on Charlie Javice. And now that you're here, leave a comment down below with the #EmptyMug and let me know what you think of this whole situation. And if you want to see more videos like this where I investigate scammers and schemers, then subscribe so you can slurp up all the tea I am spilling here on Guzzle about shady moneymakers. Thank you again for watching all the way to the end, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, y'all.